Okay, so I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing Dr. Jane Setter. Jane Setter is Professor of Phonetics at the University of Reading, UK, and a National Teaching Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. She began her academic career at the University of Leeds in 1992, before moving to the Hong Kong Polytechnic University in 1995, returning to the UK in 2001. She is a regular contributor to the University College London Summer Course in English Phonetics. Professor Setter has published widely on phonology in second language Englishes and emerging global varieties of English, and also in children with speech and language differences, with a particular focus on suprasegmental aspects such as rhythm and intonation. He is probably best known as co-editor of the Cambridge English Pronunciation Dictionary, CUP 2011, the Cambridge Handbook of Phonetics 2022, and as co-author of Hong Kong English, Edinburgh University Press 2010, and single author of Your Voice Speaks Volumes, It's Not What You Say, But How You Say It, OUP 2019. A popular keynote speaker at international conferences, Professor Setter is a regular commentator in the British media on issues relating to English pronunciation, speech features, and attitudes to accent, and has appeared on UK television and radio. In her spare time, Professor Setter is an accomplished rock vocalist. Professor Setter, it's our honor to introduce your paper, English Pronunciation for a Global World.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly well.
Good. Thank you so much, Gabriela, for that introduction. And I'm not a Spanish speaker, sadly, but I would like to say gracias por la invitación a hablar today. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's hope this works. It normally does, but things happen. Okay, are you able to see the presentation? I haven't started to animate it yet. Yes,
yes.
Good. I'm getting a thumbs up. That's wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to speak today about English pronunciation for a global world. This is partly, well, mostly actually to do with a publication that I produced with my colleagues Robin Walker and Eling Lowe for Oxford University Press recently. It's a position paper and it's free to download, and I believe you have this information about where you can get this document from if you would like to read it. But I'm going to talk about some aspects of this. So we know that English is an international language. I don't need to tell you that. And as such, it doesn't belong to speakers like me, British, or indeed American speakers, the way that it used to. And in fact, we could question whether it ever has really belonged to those groups because it is such a widely spoken language. The globalization of English in recent decades has brought about significant changes in the language. And what we might call non-native speakers, and I realize that this is a disputed term, but non-native speakers now make up more than 3/4 of English users. And these speakers have had a particularly strong influence on the pronunciation of English, which means that it's now more varied today than ever before. So our position is that the important part of English pronunciation is to support the development of mutually intelligible varieties of English, not a single variety, but varieties which are mutually intelligible with each other, so that we can use this language effectively as a means of communication. And I'm really pleased to see on the on your schedule for what you're going to be talking about over the next couple of days, so much stuff about English pronunciation and English as an international language, rather than just looking at something from an English as a foreign language point of view. It's really good to read all of those topics coming up in your conference. So, as I said, we know that English is an international language. It's spoken all over the world. It's spoken in some former colonies of Britain, but it's spoken internationally everywhere by places that didn't even have anything to do, particularly with Britain or with America. So it's widely spoken, and we have lots and lots of different varieties of the language which are available now for listeners. So in this talk, I'm going to look at 4 aspects of pronunciation, teaching and learning for a global world. The importance of pronunciation in ELT. What is good pronunciation? So how should we be thinking about that? I'll also be talking about moving from native likeness to international intelligibility, as I mentioned at the start there. And also professional development for teachers, the importance of this, and taking some of the research that we know on board about people who are teachers of English as a global language, as a foreign language, as a second language, however they are seeing themselves and how you are seeing yourselves in this particular role. Pronunciation skills are crucial for successful communication in English in today's globalized world. However, they also have a more significant contribution to make to language and learning and usage. The importance of this contribution really cannot be underestimated. Pronunciation, as far as Robin and Ealing and I are concerned, pronunciation is the most important aspect, and it underlies a lot of the other things that people are doing when they're communicating effectively in English. Pronunciation has long been accepted as an essential part of communicative competence. So that's a speaker's knowledge of a language and how to use it. And this notion of communicative competence dates back to the 1970s, when it was defined from the perspective of native speaker behaviours and cultures. However, the globalization of English in the 21st century has led to a broadening of this concept to reflect the use of English as an international language. So the goal is now to develop the language knowledge and usage skills needed for communicating with people from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. So we're developing intercultural communicative competence, not just communicative competence per se. Surveys show the majority of learners rate pronunciation as a priority. They view it as crucial in their success. And they either agree or strongly agree with survey statements highlighting its importance when learning English. Because of this, we can assume that our learners will be receptive to focusing on pronunciation in their lessons, although we know that the moment you open your mouth to speak, it can be very face-threatening for some learners. So we need to make sure that we show them that we understand they know it's crucial, we also believe it's crucial, and that we are in a safe space where learners can practice their skills. Good pronunciation relates to and can also boost performance in other areas of learning English. For example, in speaking, now you might think pronunciation speaking, but there are differences. If you look at speaking tests, they don't always include pronunciation in a very obvious way. Research indicates that deliberate pronunciation training improves students' confidence when speaking English and when doing speaking tasks. This is significant because we know from other research that students who are less sure about their pronunciation competence are less willing to participate in speaking tasks. In addition, teachers all over the world have first-hand experience of how poor pronunciation can seriously impact a learner's self-confidence. They might have difficulty in pronouncing words, and they also have a perception that their spoken English is poorly intelligible. So it is important to make sure we are working on this. But what about listening? Communicative approaches to listening traditionally focus on the application of top-down processing. And this is things like using contextual cues to understand spoken English. And this is an important level of training, of course. So on the slide here, I have a top-down view. We're looking at the top of the trees, and we can see lots of different colours and so on, but it's all a big sort of mixture. And in order to interpret this, we need to understand and be able to pick out things and be able to understand how to process those. More recently, experts in English as a foreign language listening have agreed that more attention needs to be paid to bottom-up processing, which involves decoding the individual phrases, words, and sounds that learners hear. So a bottom-up view is actually looking at what's going on at the roots, quite literally in some respects, certainly according to this picture, and being able to understand what all the bits and pieces are, the nuts and bolts, before being able to successfully interpret the top-down contextual view. Now, this is especially important for lower level learners who are often unable to make use of either contextual cues or prior knowledge to fill in the gaps in their understanding. The listeners first need to break the continuous sound of spoken English down into meaningful units, short phrases, or individual words, and they then have to quickly and accurately recognize the words or, if necessary, individual sounds. So I strongly recommend that pronunciation teaching should reintroduce the ear training and sound discrimination exercises that used to be widely used, but have been largely discredited with the arrival of communicative language teaching. So communicative language teaching very much top down, but we need the support for learners. We need to be able to return to some of these ear training things, this analytical listening, so that learners are able to then put the units together into larger units. And that is our view in the position paper. Pronunciation also overlaps with listening in terms of understanding the changes to words that speakers make in connected speech. That is, modifications to the dictionary form of a word through processes such as assimilation, elision, or our liaison. So, for example, assimilation is where sounds become more similar to each other. And if you have a phrase like that bag, then in rapid speech, very often a speaker will have a lip closure at the end of the first word. So we'll get that bag. So the sound at the end of the first word is becoming more similar to the sound at the beginning of the following word. Now, there are processes like this in most languages. They sometimes differ. So this is a process that we see happening in English. So being able to take that sort of thing on board from a listening perspective is important. Also, where sounds disappear in rapid speech. So, for example, if I have a phrase like last time, it's very unlikely that you're going to hear a speaker with my accent, certainly, but many other accents produce that T at the end of the word there. So we end up with something more like last time, where we have elided the T. Hang on a minute, my slideshow stopped there for a moment. So we end up with sounds disappearing, and this is known as elision, as I'm sure you're all aware. And also our liaison. Now, this is quite interesting. I've just written an article about this for Babel magazine. If you're interested in Babel magazine, let me know, and I will send you a link. So our liaison is where we have an R sound, often at the end of a word, and in some accents of English, like mine, this R sound is not produced unless it's followed by a vowel. So if I have a word like cart, for example, C-A-R-T, my accent doesn't produce the R. If I have a word like car, similarly not, but if it's followed by a vowel sound, then we get this linking. So car and bus, something like that. But we also find that we get it in accents like mine, where there is no R in the spelling. And this is known as an intrusive R, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So in a phrase like vanilla ice cream at the end of the first word there, a speaker from my language background is likely to say vanilla ice cream, and there's an R inserted in there. So it's useful for learners to understand what these processes are, even if we're not expecting them to use them themselves, because it can be difficult to decode things when we get these sorts of processes happening. So the effects are most noticeable when speech is rapid and spontaneous. Listeners who are unaware of them will face serious obstacles in their attempt to understand natural speed native speaker English, assuming they're listening to a native speaker. So focus on connected speech for listening is especially appropriate for intermediate and higher level learners. We wouldn't expect to start there with a beginner, but it's something that we'd expect to be incorporated with higher level learners. Also, pronunciation contributes to vocabulary learning. Students need guidance in correct pronunciation of new vocabulary at the time it's introduced. As you know, spelling pronunciation in English is not always transparent, so it's important to make sure that learners understand how to pronounce the word at the time it is produced, and not to apply their L1 sound rules. So here's an example from the position paper with this word here. In English pronunciation, the word is real, but it's not real. And if you have the same word in the first language of the learners, then they might produce it in this sort of way, or they might look at the spelling and produce it in this sort of way. So we need to make sure we are introducing the pronunciation at the time that we're introducing new words, particularly where we know there's a challenge for our learners that we are teaching. So this sort of thing, if a speaker did say real instead of real, it could be difficult for listeners with other first languages to understand, and that would compromise communication. Evidence from neurolinguistics demonstrates the importance of good English pronunciation for the retention of second language vocabulary. Words that we meet are initially processed in working memory using something that's called a phonological loop. So it kind of circles around and around. That's the simplistic way of looking at it. This consists of an inner ear and an inner voice, which hold and repeat the verbal information so that it can be transferred successfully from working memory into long-term memory. And of course, using the vocabulary is important. Most researchers now agree that good pronunciation assists the phonological loop in successfully preparing new vocabulary for storage in long-term memory, and then it can be retrieved for later use with the target pronunciation form. And also reading. For beginners who are learning to read in English, pronunciation is not an optional extra because of the way written forms of English words are processed in working memory. Both L1 and L2 reading involves decoding written words by accurately and fluently matching sounds to the letters or letter combinations on the page. Thus, knowing the correct pronunciation contributes positively to word reading fluency and more general to overall reading fluency. So it is something which also contributes to that. So we can see from this that pronunciation contributes to success in the 4 skills: speaking, listening, vocabulary learning, and reading. Actually not writing. Writing isn't down there, is it? But it does actually contribute to those areas. Ignore what I said about 4 skills because writing's missing. But I guess vocabulary learning, you're going to have to write it down. Research into reading in English as a second language concludes that the reading problems experienced by some learners are the result of poor pronunciation of the sounds of English, and assisting these readers in improving their pronunciation could therefore help them to read better. So we don't always think about pronunciation and reading as going together, but there has been research that has shown that it's a positive aspect and makes a strong contribution. And my colleague Loie Ling says, by stressing the importance of pronunciation, teaching and learning, we can sow the seeds of our learners' success in their English studies and in their future careers. So what is good pronunciation? Tricky one. Lots of people have got different ideas about what they think good pronunciation is. Now, we can certainly say that good pronunciation may vary across speakers. So we see speakers that sound quite different, but they still have good pronunciation. A speaker's intelligibility is not affected by non-native accent. However, research has shown that intelligibility and accentedness are two separate issues. You can speak with a strong first language accent in English or in your L2 and still be highly intelligible. So you can retain your non-native accent and still be very clearly understood. Now, something that researchers are aiming for, if you like now, or are advocating is comfortable intelligibility. Researchers and international guidelines for language teaching concur that for English, good pronunciation is what successfully contributes to effective and efficient communication in a given situation. Being understood in a language is much more important for international communication in a global world than sounding like a native speaker. What is comfortably intelligible to the listener, whether they are native or non-native speakers, should be the aim, and not having a particular native-like accent, although that's something that a learner might aspire to separately. From a teaching point of view, we believe that comfortable intelligibility should be the initial goal at least. Comfortable intelligibility is listener oriented in that it involves productive accommodation to both the listener and the context on the part of the speaker. So we need to make sure we're increasing the intercultural sensitivity of our speakers as well. In an English as an international language paradigm, no single accent of English automatically represents good pronunciation. So it doesn't matter if you are a native speaker, a non-native speaker, if you're a speaker of a standard accent or otherwise, that's not important. What's important is being comfortably intelligible, enabling your messages to be produced in a way that the listener is able to understand them in a comfortable sort of way. And in the position paper, we have this figure, which is looking at limited international intelligibility versus high international intelligibility versus learners' personal pronunciation goals. So you can achieve a variety of different goals through a different route, or through the same route basically, and then splitting off towards the end. So teachers may find that within one class, some learners aspire to a native speaker accent and others to international intelligibility. Fortunately, there's a lot of common ground between these two goals. Experts are researching how pronunciation can be taught in a way that allows learners to follow the same route initially and then branch out to pursue their own personal long-term goals, whether that's being having a native speaker accent or international intelligibility. As this figure from the position paper illustrates, the pronunciation features in the lingua franca core, which I'll speak about in a moment, provide a shared path over the common ground, allowing learners to quite quickly become widely intelligible to willing interlocutors, both native and non-native speakers in most contexts. And from there, learners can pursue their personal pronunciation goals. Okay, now, so here's some questions for you. I'm not going to be able to address them right this minute, but we can come back to them at the end, and maybe you can we can talk about them in the chat. We'll see how we're doing. But just some questions for you to think about. Do you personally prefer a native or a non-native model? This is going to have an effect on your teaching, and also it's going to have an effect on your learners. But for you personally, what do you prefer? Now, it's quite interesting because I've been to conferences where people have said the thing they've most enjoyed about my presentation was listening to me speak in a native speaker accent. Okay, that's fine, but you know, it's what sort of thing you prefer, whether you prefer a native or a non-native model, and that is going to have an influence on your teaching. But also another question is, do your students prefer a native or a non-native model? Because that can also affect your teaching and affect the way you approach it. And as we're advocating comfortable intelligibility, certainly in initial stages, this might be something that you want to think about, and you want to think about with your learners, because it might be the case that learners are not going to be speaking to people with British or American type accents or Australian accents, other native speaker accents. They might be speaking to a range of people in English that come from different language backgrounds. So from that point of view, is it relevant in today's global world to just be thinking about native speaker models? But we shouldn't say, if a learner wants to have a native-like model, that they shouldn't aspire to it if that's one of their own personal learning goals. Now, something that we do know for sure is that we are living in an extremely linguistically diverse Anglophone world. Native-like accents are becoming less important to learners. It's assumed by many that native speaker teachers are the best kind for various reasons. And this is referred to by Widdowson, for example, as the native speaker fallacy. So it's not crucial in effective teaching of pronunciation for somebody to be a native speaker. Just because somebody speaks a language fluently and has implicit knowledge, it does not mean they have explicit knowledge, can explain the language, or are able to teach it. It's also quite likely that monolingual native speaker teachers have little or no linguistic or cultural understanding of the learners they are teaching, particularly if they're parachuted in on various schemes, things like the native English teacher schemes that you see in some countries. Cultural and linguistic understanding are really vital elements. These teachers might also not be a particularly good example of somebody who's intelligible in international English. And I'm pretty sure that you will have met native speakers that you can't understand. I really hope I'm not one of them, but I've certainly met native speakers from Britain, from America, that I can't understand, or it takes me a while to understand their patterns. So it's not necessarily the case that just because you're a native speaker, you're going to be this wonderful teacher. Non-native speaker teachers bring a wealth of experience to the classroom. They've learned the language explicitly. You have learned the language explicitly. You know its rules. You probably know your learner's first language. I would assume that in your case, and which sorts of problems may arise because of this. And if we have teachers that aren't in that situation, non-native speaker teachers that are coming from other language backgrounds, they can draw on their own experience as learners. And they've normally received teacher training as well. And as I say, that's not always the case for some of these people who are brought in on native English speaker schemes from countries like the UK and Australia and the US to act as language teachers in countries around the world. It really isn't possible to overemphasize the important qualities of non-native speaker teachers and what you bring to the learning environment. Absolutely vital, and you should never, ever underestimate that. because I mean, I've been a teacher for many years. I haven't taught pronunciation for a while, interestingly, not specifically pronunciation classes, but I do teach phonetics and phonology. And it really is important for me, if I'm teaching people from different language backgrounds, and I do have MA students from all over the world, that I make sure I have some knowledge of what's going on in their first language phonology, so that I can understand what the problems are likely to be, and so that we can discuss it and raise some awareness about this. So vital importance. The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages states, in language teaching, the phonological control of an idealized native speaker has traditionally been seen as the target, with accent being seen as a marker of poor phonological control. The focus on accent and on accuracy, instead of on intelligibility, has been detrimental to the development of the teaching of pronunciation. So that is coming from CEFA, the Common European Framework Reference for Languages, and that was a statement put out in 2018. Given its oppressive linguistic history, speakers of older varieties of English, like British and American varieties, are basically extremely lucky, in my opinion, that English is the global language. I'm still amazed that people want to speak it at all, given the situation with colonialism and so on. But they do want to speak it, and increasing numbers want to speak it. For example, English has recently been adopted by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as its working and official language. Member countries are Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, several of which have never had anything to do with the British Commonwealth. Every speaker of English is entitled to an English-speaking identity if they want one. And this should not be subject to judgment, stereotyping, or criticism by speakers of older varieties. What should be important is the ability to communicate clearly, to be intelligible. That's the important part. And all speakers need to learn to be intelligible in international contexts. And that includes people like me and other people from the UK, from the United States, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, etc. We need to think about this. We need to be intelligible in international contexts and develop accommodation skills to help us understand other speakers and move towards a mutual intelligibility in English. I don't always feel that we're getting that at the moment. So we have this paradigm shift from nativeness to international intelligibility. As I've said many times in this presentation, we're moving from native likeness as a goal to English pronunciation for international intelligibility. And that provides learners with an attainable goal. We've seen that a native-like accent, it can be unattainable for most learners, and this can be off-putting. So we want to make sure that learners have an attainable goal. It respects their right to show their identity, and it allows them to pursue a native speaker accent if they choose. So key aspects of teaching international intelligibility, as you'll see outlined in the position paper. One of them is the lingua franca core. This is probably the best known. It was the best known version is the one by Jennifer Jenkins, which she called the lingua franca core, although there have been intelligibility syllabuses is the wrong word, frameworks, if you like, around for longer than that. So this specifies elements of pronunciation which research has shown are important for international intelligibility, and these elements include, go on, got stuck again. There we go. Most consonant sounds, if you hear me talking to my PowerPoint, is because it's got stuck. The aspiration of these three voiceless plosive sounds at the beginnings of words. Consonant clusters, which are important. So we've got some at the beginning and end there, and at the ends of words. So consonant clusters are important as well. Vowel length is something that she views as important or has found to be important. Word stress, So if I have a word spelled D-I-F-F-E-R and somebody produces it as defer, then it's actually a different word, and that can mean that it's difficult to pass the message. So word stress is important. Nuclear stress or sentence focus, so talking about the blue one, not the red one. That's the place where the contrast is, and not saying something like the blue one, not the red one, where you're focusing on something that's not the contrasted item. So sentence focus is important. Chunking, which is dividing the stream of speech into meaningful units that usually coincide with grammatical units, so the phrase level, the clause level, the sentence level, that kind of thing. And something else that's important is exposing learners to a variety of different accents. So what we're looking at here is something called receptive competence. In the past, a great deal of pronunciation and listening practice was restricted to a small number of native speaker accents. Now, a wider range of accents are being used in listening practice. And in the future, learners will need opportunities to hear an even greater variety of native speaker and non-native speaker accents. Pronunciation practice activities will also have to offer explicit guidance in the ways that different accents in English affect what a listener might expect. So if you know that the person that you're listening to regularly pronounces a w sound as a v sound, for example, so saying a word like well as vel, then it's much easier to adjust your listening to that speaker because you know that's something that they might do. So again, we're talking about having intercultural competence and having some knowledge and understanding of a variety of different sorts of accents. Also, helping learners to develop accommodation skills is very important. Specifically designed classroom activities can allow learners to hear, analyse is important, and compare key features among a variety of accents. For instance, learners could listen to how different speakers deal with a specific pronunciation issue, such as the TH in words like this, those, and then comment on what they've heard and even on which pronunciation they prefer. This kind of guided exposure helps learners improve the ability to understand other speakers' accents. That is, it improves their receptive accommodation, and this in turn facilitates international intelligibility, helps learners to see accent as a natural phenomenon, and increases their openness towards diversity, which is something we also want very much. So taking intelligibility into account in the classroom rather than native likeness has a number of benefits. It releases teachers from the need to cover aspects of pronunciation which have not been shown to contribute to people from a range of language backgrounds communicating effectively with each other. I mean, who cares if you're producing a TH sound as a the or a the or a v? It doesn't matter as long as you are understanding what a speaker is doing. Effective communication has got to be the most important goal for a language user, and that's kind of where we're headed with this position paper that we've produced. And we also see in research, and my PhD student has recently done some research on this aspect in Saudi Arabia, and he's found that actually both the native and the non-native speaker teachers that he looked at in Saudi Arabia who were teaching English were moving much more towards an intelligibility goal rather than one that was based on native likeness, which is really interesting. So I'm going to move on to professional development for teachers. English is operating as the dominant language of global communication. Goals of pronunciation and teaching and learning have shifted. Whereas it was once assumed that learners aspired to a native speaker accent and that they would be communicating in English with native speakers, the emphasis is now on helping them to become intelligible in international communication. Current approaches reflect the view that although users of English need to understand the many different accents they will encounter, they can choose the accent that they wish to aim for. But what about actual professional development for teachers? What we do know is that teachers often report that they've not had the opportunity to acquire the relevant knowledge and skills to help them teach pronunciation. This is clearly a problem. So here's another question for you to think about that we might want to talk about later. But have you been offered training in pronunciation teaching during your career, at any point during your career? Is it something that wasn't happening earlier on, but more recently you've had the opportunity to talk about this in more detail? And, you know, these sorts of conferences are really good places for thinking about these issues, thinking about pronunciation, and they're very useful for continuing professional development, not just for presenting papers. Teachers often report they've not had the opportunity to acquire the relevant knowledge and skills to help them teach pronunciation. And in addition, many English teachers are anxious about the perceived inadequacy of their own accent. And this is both native and non-native speaker teachers. We do see this with both groups. This lack of confidence is a result of the emphasis that was previously placed on native speaker accent as the ultimate goal of pronunciation practice. And although surveys of learners indicate a shift towards international intelligibility as the perceived goal, this may not be reflected in the goals that non-native speaker English teachers set themselves. Their role as models of English for their students may still push them towards pursuing a native speaker accent, even if they're aware of English as an international language and its emphasis on intelligibility. So I'd be interested to hear from you what you think about that. Now, interestingly, studies show that learners place less importance on the native speaker quality of their teachers' accents than teachers do themselves, and they place more importance on being able to communicate effectively in spoken English. So what sort of activities can we do in terms of professional development for teachers? Teachers certainly perceive a need for professional development, and many learners value pronunciation highly and are likely to respond positively if their teachers display knowledge and pedagogical competence in the pronunciation of English. So what sort of things might we want to see in a professional development series of lectures or a series of classes for teachers? This development could include a good understanding of the implications of the globalization of English. So being able to understand that this means that there are lots of different varieties out there, and that the implications for this are not that we should all be trying to sound like an American speaker, etc., but that we should be thinking about being understood in English because of the range of listeners that we're going to be speaking to. It's got stuck again. There we go. Also, an increased understanding of the phonetics and phonology of both English and the learners' first languages. Now, I would think that this group that I'm speaking to here has a key role to play in this respect, because you are the people who can impart this increased understanding of the phonetics and phonology of English or of the languages that you are teaching to teachers of various languages, including English, in your context. So definitely an important role for people in this conference to play. Also, a working knowledge of how transfer from the learner's first language can both be an obstacle and a resource. So we tend to think of transfer as negative transfer, of being something that's bad, of importing something from your first language into the second language. But it's not necessarily the case that it's bad. It could be that you can use that as something, yes, we have that in that language, and you can use it in the language that you're learning as well. And also an awareness of how pronunciation is acquired in a second language. This is also important. So understanding the processes of acquiring second languages. A working knowledge of tips and techniques for effective classroom teaching. And actually, in this respect, I would strongly recommend that everybody joins the IATEFL, the International Association of Teachers of English for a Foreign Language, including the Pronunciation Special Interest Group, which has a series of webinars running all year on this kind of thing, which is very, very useful. And access to a bank of reliable teaching resources is also important, including practical activities, apps, and websites. So we tell our students not to be on our phones, but sometimes having an app on a phone is a really useful thing. You need to build that in effectively. Oops, I've missed one out. There we go. And access to different varieties of World Englishes through online databases of speech corpora. So there are a number of online databases that have free access to different varieties of English. So Robin, who's the main author on this document, has said that investing in teacher development in the teaching of pronunciation is crucial. It gives teachers the opportunity to acquire the knowledge and skills to help learners improve their language, prepare for examinations, and communicate in English with greater confidence. Okay, so in summary, are we going to go on to the next slide or not? There we go. Right, in summary, yes, I've got to the end. The main pronunciation goal for English learners today is international intelligibility, and we're looking at comfortable intelligibility. Learners can choose to work towards a native speaker model if they wish, but this is not something that we believe should be focused on, certainly not in the initial stages. It's not necessary to be a native speaker to teach and assess pronunciation effectively. In fact, often it's just the wrong thing altogether. Pronunciation teaching and learning can support the development of other skills. Teacher training and education in pronunciation teaching and learning is vital. So those are the main points there. You can download the position paper from here. If you've got your phone out, you can just grab that there, but I think it's in the conference proceedings, or it has been circulated. You can also follow the link, so oup.com/ELT/expert/pronunciation. You can find it there too. But do download it. It's a free document. You don't have to pay for it. And we would be very glad to know if you found it to be useful. Okay, so having whittled on for all that time, I've now got to the end, and I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen and see if you have any questions, or if you'd like to go back to any of the questions that I have asked you.
Okay, Jane, thank you very much. It was very interesting and important, all the questions and the topics you raised, especially for the ones that are here. We are having teachers and professors and researchers from all over Argentina, but also from different places of Latin America and Europe. And so I'm very glad to hear you raise the questions you raised. For the rest of the people, of course, we are going to be sharing the link that Professor Seta gave us now in the last part in the classroom, in the virtual classroom of the conference. So you will have it uploaded there. Okay, then I have some questions. Malvina Massaro and Sabrina Silvestrin and Marina Palmieri say that they are interested in the link to the Our Liaison article that you named. If you could give them the link to the article.
Okay. I've just written this, so it's not been published yet. It's published in a magazine called Babel. I'll put the link in the chat for Babel magazine.
You can see that now, yes.
Yeah, Babel magazine. Okay.
Great.
And that will be out, so that there's an edition out at the moment, which doesn't have it in because I've only just written it, but it will be in the next edition. So there we go. So it's babelzine.co.uk. You can subscribe to it online. There's also paper copies of it too. It's a quarterly magazine. And as I say, there's an issue out at the moment. I'm not sure which issue is out just now. If you follow me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is, I'll put that in the chat too. So there we go, that's me on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, then when the magazine comes out, what they normally do is they tweet the article that I've written so that you can see it in its entirety. They don't tweet the whole magazine, but you can see that. And I think the one that I've just done, they tweeted fairly recently. I'm trying to remember what it was I wrote about. I just write so much stuff for them. I've completely forgotten. Oh, that was right. It was to do with how, excuse me, how when you see a written form, it gets stuck in your head in such a way that you don't realize that you might be pronouncing it differently. And it has a number of things to do with speech and writing in it, which is quite interesting. And it also includes something called the stroke effect, which I'm sure you're aware of, which is where they asked people to, they gave people a list of words in different colors, and they asked people to say the color. And then they gave color words in the same color where the word was written in the same color, and they asked them to produce that. And then they gave them color words where the word red, for example, was written in blue, and they asked them to say the color of the word, not the word. And it's all looking at how once you see something written down, it's kind of ingrained in such a way that it's really difficult to override. And I've written about that in terms of how when we see written text, we tend to assume that we're pronouncing all of the letters as sounds, and it looks at things like connected speech. So if you follow me on Twitter, then that was tweeted fairly recently, and I think I retweeted it, so you can get a copy of that one.
All right, thank you very much. Hernan Piperno asks, what would you say ranks as good pronunciation for future teachers of English? Is it important that they stick to one variety or accent?
Well, I mean, I think this can vary a lot depending on the teacher. As we said, for some people, their aim is to sound like a native speaker. And if that is your aim as a teacher and that's the accent that you aspire to, then we're not saying don't use that accent. We're not saying that. What we are saying is that we feel that it's less important that people, including teachers, are trying to have a particular kind of native speaker accent. What's more important is that when you speak a language, whether it's English or any other, that you are understood in that. So if you were speaking to me with an Argentinian Spanish accent, for example, if I was having difficulty understanding you, whether I'm from the UK, which I am, or if I'm from China, or if I'm from Germany or somewhere like that, if I was having difficulty understanding you, then it would obviously be something that you would need to work on in order to improve your pronunciation. And whether that took you towards a native speaker model or whether it takes you towards these models more to do with intelligibility, I think that's a matter for the individual teacher to make a decision about. But I'm not going to tell you that everyone should be speaking American English or British English. And, you know, there are so many varieties within those two variants that it wouldn't be reasonable for me to do so. But a lot of the materials that are available are still based on accents which are similar to mine if they're British English, or accents which are general American. We've still got a lot of material out there that's like that. But, you know, the reality is that our learners are going to hear a lot of different people speaking English. And we need to think about how we're best serving the learners, really, I think. Not sure if that answers the question, but anyway.
Okay, thank you. Adriana Caldis is asking, what is the role intonation plays when we aim at intelligibility? Okay,
so according to Jennifer Jenkins' Lingua Franca core, we generally consider three elements of intonation: tonality, tonicity, and tone. So those three things. Tonality is what Jennifer Jenkins refers to as chunking. So this is breaking speech into units that match with meaning and grammar. So I'm sure you've had this situation where you've given your learners a passage and you're asking them to read it out in class, and they read it and they get to the end of the line and they go, oh, and then they get to the end of the next line and they go, oh, and they break it all up in a way that doesn't make sense because they're not chunking it into meaningful units. So that's tonality, and that's something that's seen as important in the core. The other thing that's seen as important in the core is tonicity, and Jenkins calls this focus placement. And this is to do with, sometimes it's called the tonic or the nucleus, but it's to do with placing the any kind of tonal feature on a particular word, and the default position is the stressed syllable of the last content word. But if we've got contrast going on, or if we've got given information, new information, then we might want to de-accent things and move that around to indicate specific sorts of meanings. And that's also seen as something that is important. In Jenkins' research, she didn't find that it made any difference if people were using tones that were unexpected. And in fact, she tended to find that on questions people were rising and on statements they were falling, which tends not to be much of a problem. Although, as you know, it's not always the case that the pitch falls on a question or rises on a question. It could do either of those, and we get other sorts of patterns as well. But that was not the thing that was found to be communicatively important. So for intelligibility, the focus is the chunking and the focus placement, so the tonality and the tonicity. And also word stress to some extent is in there as well. It wasn't originally in the core, I think, but it's tied up with focus placement. So it's also something that we need to think about. So where is that main stress in the word, and where am I putting my tone there? If you have advanced learners, then you can do much more stuff with them to do with intonation. I don't think that's really, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but for intelligibility, those are the two things that it's recommended that you focus on. And I've had lots of fun with my learners trying to get them to do focus placement, because as we know, in some languages, you always put the focus or the tonic on the last word or the last syllable. And I certainly have had that from Spanish speaking learners in the past. So things like the red one, not the blue one, that sort of thing. I've certainly experienced that. So actually getting people to think about the communicative value of doing that in English is something which can be a fun game. And I've enjoyed doing that with learners in the past.
Thank you very much. Roxana Basso is saying, thank you for a wonderful presentation, Jane. It's an honor to have you at UNSAM.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And Romina Paola, sorry, I don't have the name here, says, answering your question today, when you asked whether we prefer the native or non-native model, as a young teacher, I used to idealize the native British model, which had been the one I received in my training career from 1997 to 2000. So I started teaching with that in mind. Now I have gained much more intercultural awareness, especially when it comes that English is an international language, and as you say, it is not clear where it belongs. So I always tell the students that they should focus on speaking clearly and fluently rather than thinking about pronouncing like a native, which in fact they are not. Now you have clearly defined this idea with the concept of intelligibility. It has brought me light, and I do appreciate it a lot. I share your views as regards the fact that it is not necessary to be a native to teach pronunciation. Thanks a lot, Jane. You are great.
Oh, bless you. Thank you, Romina Paola. That's really kind. Hello. Thank you very much. I think a lot of people are moving in that direction as well. So it looks like you spotted this before you heard me, or before you'd read other things. But you know, English, it's just not in the control of native speakers anymore. And I think when we've been talking about doing another edition of the Cambridge English Pronouncing Dictionary, for example, I know that the Oxford, the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, the big dictionary of English, they are incorporating a lot of different varieties now in their pronunciation. When they give the pronunciations, they're doing that and enabling people to, if they're searching online with it, to hear different sorts of pronunciations from different varieties of English. And I think it really is something that that's changed so much that we have to recognize that we can't control it. It's a language that has become this global phenomenon. You know, I mean, who knows? We've had the question about whether in 50 years' time everyone's going to be speaking Mandarin Chinese, or, you know, maybe later on, if there's big economic changes, everyone's going to be speaking a Spanish variety of some kind. It's all to do with power and what happens in the world, but also the spread of this has meant that it's something which is not in the control of native speakers, and we have to recognize that and support the intelligibility of speakers of the language, rather than thinking about, you know, they don't sound like a native speaker. It's so much less important than it has been in the past.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Romina Paula. It's really interesting to hear your point on that.
David is asking, are the learners who choose to express their identity in their English sacrificing some of their intelligibility internationally?
I don't think you have to sacrifice intelligibility to do this. Again, we found in a lot of research where people have asked learners about their thoughts about their identity as an English speaker, they've said that it's important that they sound like who they are and where they're from. But we do need to make sure we're striking a balance where the pronunciation is intelligible enough that it doesn't jeopardize the communication. So I think, you know, as teachers and as learners, we need to think about this and think about how far we need to go down a route in order to make sure that our learners are speaking in a way which is clearly intelligible, and if they want to express their identity, that they're doing such in a way that doesn't mean that it jeopardizes that intelligibility. But yeah, I mean, you know, there are a variety of speakers out there. It's very I think it's often the case that you can listen to people for a little while and you kind of tune into them, and then you know how they're speaking. And this is one of the things to do with accommodation, so that if there are features that make it difficult for somebody to understand a speaker, that both speakers are meeting together in the middle, rather than, you know, this speaker saying, well, I have to sound more like that. We're actually getting the listener and the speaker sort of meeting together, so that they're able to communicate effectively. And these are the sorts of skills that we want our learners to have. So, you know, it might be a difficult goal, but I'm not saying that it's not the case that if you have a strong L1 accent that it's going to be a problem for intelligibility. I'm not saying that, but I do think it's possible to sound like a Spanish language speaker speaking English and be very, very strongly intelligible. It's not the case that accent is the thing that makes a speaker unintelligible.
Thank you very much. Marianne is asking, and I suppose this will be the last question. So, is intelligibility also considered for future teachers, even if they are considered to be role models in some way, or is it just considered for students?
Well, I think if you do look at the position paper, we believe it's for teachers and for students. So being a good role model means being intelligible in the language that you are speaking and teaching, so that you can inspire your learners to be intelligible as well. Now, this may mean that you have more of a native-like accent yourself, if that's something that you have learned to do, or it may not. But yes, we're thinking that it's something for teachers as well. And it's the same sort of position, really. We're saying that English is a global language, and that there are many, many different varieties of English out there, and that if you are a teacher, the main goal should be being intelligible yourself, so being a good role model in that you are clearly understood, and this is something that you should be passing on to your learners. So, you know, if you can demonstrate as a teacher that you can have a conversation with somebody else from a different first language background and everyone understands everyone else, then, you know, the learners are going to take that on board. I think if you speak in a way that is not going to be intelligible, then that's not something that we would necessarily promote. So it's something for teachers and students to think about, not just something that we're saying is the case for learners.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to make just two comments, very brief. One was when I heard you speaking about the importance of ear training and analytic listening. I remember the very first professor we had on phonetics of phonology and pedagogy of phonetics and phonology, Magister Clem Baraldi de Duran. She said that it was very important to teach to hear, you know, because many times that to hear the sounds that the students make, to be able to help them be understood when they speak. Yes. So on that matter, we included this year a workshop on acoustics that is new. We're going to have the workshop on acoustics this evening at 5 p.m. And I suppose that is pretty important, the sense that you were speaking, I guess. Just to tell you, we have our own diploma on pedagogy of phonetics and phonology to train teachers professionally, both in segmental, suprasegmental, and also to discuss pronunciation issues. And I suppose that this is important to mention because the coordinator of the diploma is here, which is the Magister Roxana Basso that thanked you before. Well,
thank you. I've had the pleasure of meeting Roxana, and she and I have spoken many times, and I'm really glad to hear that that kind of training is available to your teachers. It is very important, whether it's acoustic training or whether it's just listening, ear training, that sort of thing. Anything that kind of raises awareness of analytical listening, I think, is important and can really help teachers and learners as well understand what's going on with pronunciation. So thank you.
Do you have the time for one last question, Jane? Or
yes, of course, yes.
Okay, so Patricia Green is asking, your experience as a UK, as an academic, what is that native UK speakers across the UK prioritize, accent or pronunciation?
Yeah, well, this is something that I've written on in the past. I'm afraid that Britain at the moment is it's a very prejudicial place, let's say. I'm not sure if you're aware of what's happening. I'm sure you've heard the word Brexit. So we have a lot of people in the UK who are not very keen on anything that marks speakers out as being not from the UK. And that's a kind of sad political situation that we've got ourselves into recently. As far as language teachers are concerned, we are interested, pronunciation teachers are unified, I think, in being interested largely in intelligibility now and not in particular sorts of accents, although there are a lot of people around who still do something that they call accent reduction. You may have seen programs offering accent reduction, and the idea is that it's removing an accent, but actually what you're doing is you're adding another accent. It's really accent addition, so it's learning another accent, and that's normally a native speaker variety of some kind. So I think from the point of view of language teachers in the UK, I don't know really if we're prioritizing any particular accent, but the sort of accent that you tend to see in textbooks in the UK is likely to be Southern Standard British, although I do also see Northern Standard British as well in some materials. And I think the main reason for that is because there is such a wide variety of accents in the UK, and these are also subject to prejudice and stereotyping. So people believe that if you have a strong Birmingham accent, for example, that you're not very intelligent, or if you have a strong Yorkshire accent that you're very friendly and loyal, or that if you have a Welsh accent that you're very friendly. So we do have these stereotypes in the UK which are not particularly helpful. But I do hear we tend to get kind of Northern and Southern Standard, at least in England. And if you go to Scotland, then you're going to hear different sorts of accents, and Wales and Ireland, of course, Northern Ireland, you'll hear different sorts of accents. But I think we tend to stick to some kind of standard variant. So we'll tend to stick to a Southern British Standard or a Northern British Standard or a Scots Standard or something like that, because it doesn't necessarily serve learners to learn a variety of English that's quite kind of niche and may take with it negative connotations. So we are also thinking about that too. But you know, it's a minefield. I don't really know what more I can say on that topic, but I definitely can't say to you that everybody in the UK sounds like me, because they do not.
Of course. Well, thank you very much. It's Leopoldo La Bastilla, a friend of us, saying thank you very much as well. So, well, Jane, it was really a pleasure. There are lots of people in the chat thanking you for the presentation. It was very important for us, and well, thank you very much. And of course, you're invited to the rest of the conference if you want to stay, or else, of course, we'll be contacting you in case you want to publish your paper in our book.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jane. All right. So
thank you.
Now,
bye-bye, everyone. I might drop in later. I've got another meeting now, but I might drop in later on. So thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Okay. So now I'll give the word to Paula Lopez Cano, who is going to coordinate our opening panel. That's going to be on Roxana Basso, José Durán, Alejandro Renato, y Graciela Jacur. So, Paula, over to you.
Okay.